of your Zoom screen, kind of in the middle, and type your question in the center, and I'll look over those and we'll try to combine some and get to as many as we can. A little background on Washington's Trail 1753. We are a registered Pennsylvania nonprofit, and we work to inform the public about the historic importance of George Washington's 1753 mission, a mission that brought the 21-year-old George Washington to Western Pennsylvania and directly led to the outbreak of the French and Indian War here in North America. Besides presentations like today, our group sponsors a one-day summit, usually in October, and that looks at different aspects of Washington's mission. We also produce an electronic newsletter and help sponsor historic hikes and reenactments. We are currently working to build an expanded website that will cover additional historic events of the French and Indian War in Western PA. This new website will also provide a guide to heritage tourism and outdoor recreation opportunities along the route that Washington traveled in 1753. The National Park Service is helping us with that effort, and we are looking for more financial support to bring this interactive website to its greatest potential. So if you like today's presentation, I encourage you to make a tax-deductible donation at our website, washingtonstrail.org. Now to introduce our speaker, here's Steering Committee volunteer, Marilyn Black.
Good morning. My name is Marilyn Black, and I'm a volunteer assisting the Washington Trail 1753 Steering Committee. I also happen to have had the pleasure of meeting today's speaker in person and also reading one of his books. Therefore, I'm confident that you'll enjoy and learn from his presentation. Today's guest speaker is Dr. Charles E. Williams of Shippenville, Pennsylvania. Dr. Williams is an ecologist and archaeologist with particular interests in the past and present landscapes of the northern Allegheny Plateau and the Appalachian region. Chuck, as he prefers to be called, was a Fulbright Scholar in environmental history and archaeology at the University of Iceland. His PhD in ecology was earned at Virginia Tech, and he recently added another master's in archaeology and heritage from the University of Leicester in England. Dr. Williams was a professor of biology at Clarion University of Pennsylvania for 15 years. He currently teaches biology and ecology online for Columbia Southern University. He also has a consulting business called Williams Ecological LLC. He happens to also be an author, including several books, such as Western Pennsylvania's Oil Heritage in the Postcard series, printed by Arcadia Publishing in 2008. He also authored Along the Buck Trail Highway, Along the Allegheny River, and also several papers on the iron industry in Clarion County. Today's topic is the Venango Path, Then and Now. The information which Chuck will share with us is from his current research on landscape archaeology and environmental history, especially the historic Allegheny River Basin. It's my pleasure to turn the program over to Dr. Williams.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here today. Like most of you, I'm used to meeting with people live. We are live, obviously, but virtually live. So things are sometimes a little bit different in terms of presentations in Zoom, as you probably know. I'm trying to fire this up right now. Here we go. I hope you can all see my screen. What I want to talk about today is the Venango Path, Then and Now. And as you know, the Venango Path was a very important Native American path, also military path used by the English and the French in the French and Indian War, and was also used by the American military through the early 1800s, and was modified actually during the War of 1812 to move materials from Pittsburgh to Presque Isle in the building of the Lake Erie Fleet for the Americans. So what I want to do today is several things. The goals of this presentation are to introduce paths, trails, and roads. We know about paths, trails, and roads, but what kind of information is out there? How do they differ? Do they differ? How are paths, trails, and roads studied? And then talk in particular about Venango, which is present-day Franklin, and the Venango path. And I should say the Venango paths, because there were a number of paths that bore the destination name Venango. And then I want to focus in particular on an interest of mine, which is the past environments along the Venango path. And I will rely on some map information and documentary information, particularly from surveyors and military that passed through that area in the 17 and 1800s. And then a little bit about the Venango path today. Now, in regards to paths, trails, and roads, there are some differences. For example, as we move from that continuum from path to trail to road, several things change. There's an increased complexity of the system itself and an increased impact. For example, paths are typically local in spatial extent. You know, it might be a path going from one house in a village to another. It might be a path going to the outhouse even. The timing of use is that they're used daily. The traffic volume is usually low, and there's little to no investment in construction. So these paths are usually general use. They're used by individuals for daily movements. Now, trails are a little bit more organized and they're a little bit more long distance. So really what we're talking about today is a trail in terms of the Venango path. But I'll use those two terms, path and trail, interchangeably because we've named the Venango path for a very, very long time. Trails tend to be more regional, long distance. The timing of use is seasonal and periodic, particularly important for Native Americans in the seasonal rounds that they would do in the landscape. Seasonal foraging, camping, hunting, fishing, agriculture. Traffic volume is usually medium. Construction investment, again, is low. And the functions can be general to specific for trade, ceremonial purposes, even war. Roads tend to be much more organized and longer lived in terms of their longevity. They can be local, regional, and long distance. They can have many different uses in terms of timing, daily, seasonal, periodic, and the traffic volume can be high. The construction investment is also high, and usually roads are associated with much more organized cultures. Think of Inca roads, for example. Those were very highly invested roads. Roman roads, for example, in England, the same thing. So these roads tend to be much more complex. They were used for trade, military, and ceremonial purposes as well. Now, trails were pretty vital in long distance trade here in Pennsylvania. For example, some of you may know Ken Burkett. He's the executive director of the Jefferson County History Center in Brookville. And Ken has done an extensive long-term investigation of a Native American site called Fish Basket, which is on Red Bank Creek. Fish Basket is linked to other areas in Western Pennsylvania by the Frankstown Venango Path, which is right along here, and also the Punxsutawney Kittanning Trail. Now, one of the things that Ken found in terms of an artifact is this interesting looking bead on the left side of the screen. I believe it's made out of rhyolite. It's a very, very beautiful artifact. I actually held it in my hand not too long ago, and it's almost a centimeter in length. But when Ken found this bead and showed it to another archaeologist, he said, you know, I know that bead. And he pulled out pretty much virtually the same replica. And it was found at Fort Loudon near Bedford County. And apparently, this sort of links Fish Basket in that Fort Loudon area with trade, obviously by the trail system. These were identical beads, perhaps made by the same person. So, how are paths, trails, and roads studied? Well, there's a lot of different types of sources of information that you can gain to understand paths, trails, and roads. And usually we use as many sources of information as we possibly can to build an understanding of a particular trail or road. documentary information in the forms of diaries of travelers, journals, particularly of military personnel or surveyors. Deeds are particularly important, and also reports that are generated. For example, the Historic Forts and Trails Commission back in 1937 did a report on the Venango Trail, which, if you're interested, is available on the internet. And that provides a really good overview of the Venango Trail up to that point. Surveys, military and settlement surveys provide really good information at times on paths, trails, and roads. And of course, maps. Maps are very important. A good map gives you a great idea of where a particular trail may arise, may end, where it traveled in the landscape, and also images, photos, for example. Oral history is another important piece of information that we can use to understand paths, trails, and roads. This is particularly important for Native American communities, descendant communities that use oral history to maintain their traditions. One thing that I'm very interested in, and I've applied to several different types of studies, is remote sensing itself. You can use satellite imagery, or one of the coolest tools I think that's out there to understand landscapes and can be applied to paths, trails, and roads is something that we call LiDAR, which is light detection and ranging. It's also called aerial laser scanning. And that's basically what it is. You have a fixed wing aircraft or drone that fires laser beams down at the surface of the ground, and those laser beams come back and they are measured. And from that, you can gain some idea of the nature of the surface that you're looking at. So these laser beams essentially penetrate down to ground level, and you can see certain features that you can't in relation to vegetation, buildings, and those types of things. And on the right side, I have an image. This is not of the Venango Path or anything along those lines. This is a LiDAR image of the Shippenville Furnace region in Clarion County, Pennsylvania. And what you can see is a number of different features, but the roads show up very, very well. This large road here is a Game Commission access road, but there's also a small road right in here. I've actually been on that. And it links up these particular features here. And these are relic charcoal hearts. These are places where individuals in the past actually burned charcoal. And this haul road was probably where this charcoal was transported back to the furnace, which is up in this region. There's also some things that you can do with geographic information systems and modeling. And there's something called least cost path analysis that can come up with an algorithm to sort of predict where a trail might have passed. And that's kind of useful because that generates a hypothesis for us to test on the ground. And then finally, there's archaeology.
Can we please shut the mics off, please? Everybody, please turn your microphones off. Thank you.
Archaeology is particularly important in where we have established roads. Paths and trails a lot of times don't leave really good archaeology. You cannot study. But again, all of these approaches are important to understanding paths, trails, and roads. Now, most of you are probably familiar with this book here. It's sort of the main information source that we have on Native American paths and trails in Pennsylvania. And it was put together by this gentleman here, Paul Wallace, who was with the Pennsylvania Historic and Museum Commission from the 50s to the 60s. And he did a nice job for giving us sort of a basal resource for understanding Native American trails in Pennsylvania. Now, one proviso about that, some of his portions of trails are spot on. Some of them are approximations. And I like this quote from Autumn Leonard. Trails followed no precise course. They shifted with the seasons and from year to year. So basically trails can be approximations. They can be modified, and different portions of trails can be used in one portion of the year to another. For example, in the wintertime or during rainy season, there may be alternate portions of particular trails. And if you have a chance to read this paper in Pennsylvania Archaeologist by Autumn Leonard, the Presque Isle Portage and the Venango Trail, it's a worthwhile read. Now, what I'd like to do is sort of mention something new here. I was lucky enough recently to have this map given to me for research from the Jefferson County History Center. And this is a map of what was then northern Armstrong County. And I want to orient you a little bit here. The Allegheny River here is to the west. This particular water body that's going through here, it says Toby's Creek, is present-day Clarion River. And what you can see here are a number of different features here. There are tracks that are illuminated here on this particular map. There are streams, and there are also two paths, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Now, this particular map is a copy of a sketch made by a gentleman named John Buchanan. And John Buchanan was a surveyor from Philadelphia who surveyed in Clarion County until about 1800.
Excuse me, Chuck. Whoever's phone just rang, please mute your microphone. If your phone just rang in your house, please mute your microphone. Sorry, thanks, Chuck.
Okay, no problem. Again, this map is a copy of a sketch that was made by a gentleman named John Buchanan, who was from Philadelphia, and he was a surveyor in Clarion County until about 1800. So this map probably was made somewhere in the 1790s, but we can't really nail it down just yet. I still have some more work to do on it. But again, I want to direct you to these two particular lines that are going through this map right here, and I'll show you some detail. Well, there you go. There's a portion of the Venango path that goes through this particular map, and we were thrilled to see this. This is probably what is called the Venango-Katanning path, and the Venango-Katanning path did just that. It ran from Katanning in Indiana County up to Venango or Franklin in Venango County. And it's always been conjectured where the Venango path actually crossed the Clarion River. It's thought to have been at a place called Bullock's Ford. But there's also been some alternate considerations that may be across the Canoe Ripple, which is a little bit farther east. This map puts that ford for the Venango-Katanning path directly at Bullock's Ford. So that's very, very useful. But there is one more path listed on this particular map. And it's something that's called, on this map, the Cushing path. Now, probably what this is the Goshink Trail or path. And Goshink, if you are familiar with it, is at present-day West Hickory. It was a Native American town, Delaware town, on the Allegheny River. And this shows the path of the Cushing path as it proceeds through this portion of what was Armstrong County, now Clarion County. And you see a few things here from this tract to J. Buchanan's, all surveyed. So all this area has been surveyed for sale or donation to Native American, or excuse me, American Revolution soldiers in payment for their services. And it says nearly 5 miles is surveyed. And one thing that sort of stuck out, and we didn't know what this meant at first, it just says Great Licks. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And again, here's the lay of the land again, the Venango path, Venango-Katanning path, crossing the Clarion River at Bullock's Ford. And then we have this Goshink path here to the east. One thing that was interesting on this map as well is that it says here, from the Allegheny River to the most eastern end of Edward Price's tract, which is right here, is 11.25 miles. So if you measure that out on a current day map, it puts the Goshink path right at present day Sligo in Clarion County. And there is no known Native American path that has gone through Sligo, at least that's been identified to this point in time. So again, very interesting path. Note that this path goes through two particular tributaries here. And again, we've got this Great Licks thing going on. There's a series of maps that came out between 1816 and 1822. This is actually a kind of a bad copy, called the Mellish-Whitehurst maps, or Whiteside maps, excuse me. And they were a set of early county maps. They didn't have a lot of detail on them. They showed early roads. They showed some habitations, some towns, and things like that. But this is the present day Callensburg on the Clarion River. And the previous map, this is where that Venango-Katanning path crossed at Bullock's Ford. This is Licking Creek and Cherry Run that enter into the Clarion River at Callensburg. And these are those two tributaries that I showed you before that the Goshenk path was going through. And it says here, Large Salt Lick. A lot of these trails did connect to salt licks because they were great places to hunt. So if you were traveling through, you might be able to pick up dinner relatively easily. But I know this area. This is probably between the present day tributaries of Mineral Run and Anderson Run near Sligo. This is the Piney Tract, which is now a state game land. Some of you might be familiar with it. It's basically a really large strip mined area that's great for prairie birds right now. And this is Piney Creek up here. And Piney itself was a ford. So likely this Goshenk path came up through this valley here and then crossed at Piney and probably hooked up to what we know to be the Goshenk path now. So my point here is that there are a lot of different sources of information that are out there that we can study roads, paths, and trails with. And sometimes some surprising information comes out that we were not aware of previously. So at any rate, this is current research now, and I'll probably try and get to some more work on this weekend, some GIS work in particular. So the insights from this newly found map, this confirms the crossing of the Clarion River by the Venango-Katanning path at Bullock's Ford, which is basically what most people thought. This Goshenk or Goshenk path raises some questions. It did cross a salt lick between two streams, probably Anderson Run and Mineral Run. That was also confirmed with the Mellish Whiteside map, and may have forded the Clarion River at Piney. I was mentioning a geographic information system modeling approach called least cost path analysis that sometimes is used to understand how people and materials can move through landscapes. And there's a possibility I might be able to use that particular technique to see whether this purported Goshenk path forded at Piney or maybe forded the Clarion River farther west at Canoe Ripple, which is actually, I think, a better ford anyway. And Wallace does mention a path coming up from Indiana County that hooks up somewhere in Clarion County. He called it Bullock's Path. And it's a possibility that this Bullock's Path was a portion of the Goshenk path. That's another important thing to think about when you study things like trail networks. There are portions that we don't really know about that are not really connected, but were used from time to time. This image to the right is from the late Hank Huffnagel's book, Treasure Maps of Clarion County. And over here on the left side, you can see he's got the Venango-Katanning path, and he's got question marks all through there because we're not really too sure exactly where it went through the county. And up here, up to the northeastern portion of the county is actually the known Goshenk path. So we've got a lot of figuring to do in terms of how this new route of the Goshenk path actually hooks up to what's up there in the northeast. So at any rate, that's a little background on trails, paths, and roads and how you can study them. Now what I want to do is jump into Venango and the Venango path or paths and look at some destinations and routes and a little bit about Venango itself. Venango is an interesting name. Obviously, it's a Native American name that's been corrupted in English to what it is currently. The Delawares called the village of Venango Winingus. Another Native American name is Onengi. I'm not sure if that's Iroquois, Seneca or not, but supposedly both those names mean mink, as in the animal. Another interpretation is otter. Actually, minks and otter are in the same mammal family, the Mustelidae, so pick your weasel, I guess. But either way, supposedly Venango was named for a mink or otter. It was a Native American village and trading site, relatively early trading site. In 1750s, there was a gentleman named John Fraser that had a trading site there. It was visited by the Celeron expedition, the French Celeron expedition in 1749. This is a map to the right that shows the location of Venango and what is called the Rivière aux Boeufs. From that particular expedition, the Rivière aux Boeufs was the French name for French Creek. And of course, since this is a Washington Trail organization, Washington and Christopher Gist visited in their famous expedition to tell the French to leave the French Creek Valley in 1753. I'll talk a little bit about Washington's observations during his trip in 1753 in a few moments. It was a strategically important site too, in that at Venango, there were 3 forts that existed sequentially, including Fort Michaud, which was a French fort that was built between 1755 and 1757, and was then burnt in 1759 when the French retreated from the Ohio Valley. Subsequently, the English built a fort not on top of Michaud, but a little bit upstream on French Creek called Fort Venango. Fort Venango was a fort until 1763, when it was burned during Pontiac's rebellion. And of course, there was the American fort, Fort Franklin, and also a garrison of troops that was kept there in the early 1800s. And of course, Venango is present-day Franklin, Pennsylvania, beautiful town. Now, there are many routes to and from Venango, and that's why I said Venango path and paths. Depending on how you look at things, there are a number of different Venango paths. For example, the Venango path proper, as Wallace would look at it and a number of other scholars, would include 3 particular portions from Presque Isle down towards Pittsburgh. The first portion being the Presque Isle Portage. The map here on the right is modified from Wallace. I've taken the liberty to outline some of the named Venango paths that converge in Venango. That white dot is Venango. I really like that map. It looks like a sea spider or something like that. It's very interesting. But it really gives you some idea of the importance of Venango as a destination and as a trail nexus with a number of different trails converging east, west, north, and south at Venango. So the Venango path proper would include the Presque Isle Portage, which I've labeled as 1A. Presque Isle Portage was just that. It was a Native American portage from Lake Erie to the headwaters, well, not quite the headwaters, but to French Creek at LeBoeuf, where water travel could occur. It was modified by the French into a military road beginning in 1753. That whole area was a very, very swampy area. And that particular military road moved back and forth with the seasons and with the years. It was a corduroy road in some parts. Some of the wood being present in 1760 when, for example, Thomas Hutchins, who I'll talk about in a moment, was there surveying the remains of the French forts. Then there's also the northern route. That is the Venango path from Fort LeBoeuf, which is present-day Waterford, to Venango, and then the southern route, which is Venango to the forks of the Ohio. There's also the Cuyahoga Venango path, which is labeled 2 on this particular map. That goes west to the mouth of the Cuyahoga River and Delaware towns along there, also salt licks. The Venango Corn Planter path, which heads northeast, and that goes to the village of Corn Planter. It also goes to Conewango, which is basically Warren, Pennsylvania. So sometimes, depending on your end destination, this path is called the Venango Corn Planter path or the Venango Conewango path. There's also the Venango Frankstown path. When I was talking about Ken Burkett's work in finding that artifact at Fish Basket and the other artifact that was found farther at Fort Loudon, the Venango Frankstown path is what links Fish Basket, Fort Loudon, and also Venango. The Venango Chinklakamoose path, I love that name, Chinklakamoose. That is present day Clearfield. I don't know why we don't call Clearfield Chinklakamoose, but maybe we should consider it. So that is an east-west path. And then the Venango Katanning path, which I talked about in terms of that new map that we had found just recently of Clarion County. So all routes converging on Venango, very, very important place. What I'm going to do today is focus primarily on the northern route and talk a little bit about the environments and the landscapes that travelers encountered as they went from Venango up through Presque Isle. If there's any questions about environments, particularly the southern route, I'm happy to talk about that as well. So one of the things I've been interested in relation to the Venango Path is the French Creek Valley itself. What did it look like in the 18th century? And we are very lucky to have some good documentary evidence and maps from that particular time period so that we can understand what this particular environment looked like. So one of my ongoing projects is to understand these past landscapes of the French Creek Valley. And I take a geographic information approach to this, which is basically digital mapping and verifying that work through ground truthing. And one of the most important pieces of information that I work with for first cut of understanding landscapes anywhere, but particularly in the French Creek Valley, are the writings and maps of those who passed through the landscape in varied and sundry endeavors. And since the French Creek Valley was so important militarily early on, particularly during the French and Indian War, Pontiac's Rebellion, and also later in the War of 1812, there are a number of soldiers and surveyors that pass through. And I find the information from surveyors to be incredibly useful because these gentlemen are very, very detailed in what they notice, usually, not always. So they can provide you a wealth of information. Who were some of these soldiers and surveyors that came through? Obviously, George Washington and Christopher Gist in 1753. Both Washington and Gist were trained surveyors. And also, in the case of George Washington, also a land speculator. So he was very interested in what he saw during his travels. Colonel Henry Bouquet, who you might have heard about in the French and Indian War, he's famous for a maneuver that he did at Bushy Run battlefield to turn the tide in the battle at that point in time, the French and Indian War. Associated with Henry Bouquet was a gentleman named Thomas Hutchins, who I'll talk about a little bit more because he has provided a lot of insightful information on past environments of the French Creek Valley. And also Jacob Eyerly. Most people don't know much about Jacob Eyerly. He was a surveyor, he was a Moravian, and he was doing work for the Moravians at the time who had acquired land in the Erie Triangle after the purchase of 1792, and he did his work in 1794. Now, why was anybody here? Like I said, it was an important military site, largely because of the Ohio country itself. This was considered to be a very, very rich land. You know, after settlers and explorers crossed the Appalachian Mountains, they found this landscape with great soils, moderate slopes, moderate topography that looked like a Garden of Eden, basically, once they had come from the east. Washington was here to serve the French notice to leave the forts in the French Creek Valley, Forts Le Boeuf and Presque Isle. When he was here in 1753, Fort Michaud at Venango had not yet been built. Bouquet and Hutchins were basically on mop-up after the French left their forts in the valley in 1759. And then Eyerly was there to survey Moravian lands in the Erie Triangle in 1794. And of course, they all pretty much used the Venango path to access the French Creek interior. And this is a map that's modified from Paul Wallace's Indian Paths of Pennsylvania. It shows you some of the high points here. Venango, Caughnawaga, which is present day Meadville. That was also an important trade nexus too. Not as probably important as Venango, but there were a number of trails that did converge on Caughnawaga. It was also a Delaware and probably Seneca village. Fort Le Boeuf, which is Waterford, and then of course Fort Presque Isle. So the the Venango Path linked these forts for the French and was an important transport route. Likewise, another thing to think about of the French Creek Valley is not just the Venango Path, it's French Creek itself. It was used for transport, particularly downstream. So basically what we have here in the French Creek Valley is a landscape of movement, both by water and by land. Hutchins, in particular, made very useful notes on the French Creek Valley landscapes from the Venango Path in both 1759 and 1760, and I'll talk about him in a bit. Just a little bit about the French Creek watershed. It extends into New York as well, mostly in Pennsylvania. It's about 1,200 square miles in area, which is about 11% of the drainage basin of the Allegheny Basin itself. So that makes it one of the largest watersheds in the Allegheny Basin. It's largely glaciated. That makes it a relatively unique watershed in the Allegheny Basin. The others that are glaciated include Oil Creek and Oconomowoc Creek as well. And so what this creates in terms of glaciation is diverse, often rich soils. These are younger soils, they're nutrient rich. They're wonderful for growing a wide variety of vegetation. As well, there's a variety of upland, wetland, and freshwater habitats in the French Creek Valley. So you can right away think that it would be a wonderful place for Native American habitation. And indeed, when the first explorers and surveyors came into the French Creek Valley, they were astounded by the riches that they saw biologically. So George Washington's French Creek travels. As I said, he was sent in 1753 to gauge French intentions in the region, actually to tell them to leave, which they said, silly Washington, no, we're not going to leave. He arrived at Venango on 4 December. Those of you who know that trip realize that it was a long trip from Williamsburg to Fort Le Boeuf, no question about that. But to do it in the winter is a whole nother story. So they faced a lot of challenges in their trip to Venango and up through to Venango Path to the forts. Now, Washington made some, but not many observations on the local environment. He was on a mission. He wasn't just there to say, wow, look at that really nice hilltop over there. He was more worried about getting from point A to point B and keeping his scalp and staying alive. By the way, this is an older picture of George Washington. He didn't actually look like that when he was coming up the French Creek Valley. He was 21 years of age. This is a quote from Washington's journal in moving from Venango to Le Boeuf in December 1753. At 11 o'clock, we sent out for the fort and were prevented from arriving there till the 11th by excessive rains, snows, and bad traveling. Like I said, this is December. And they were in this area from December until early January, through many mires and swamps. So it was tough going, where we were obliged to pass to avoid crossing the creek, which was impossible, either by fording or rafting. The water was so high and rapid. So actually, Washington did a diversion off of the Venango Path so that he could get across French Creek at a certain place. And Paul Wallace wrote a paper about that back in the 1960s about what Washington's route may have been. And then 11 December 1753, he had this to say in his journal: "We passed over much good land since we left Venango, and through several extensive and very rich meadows, one of which I believe was nearly 4 miles in length and considerably wide in some places." Now, one of the sort of myths of the eastern deciduous forest of North America was that it was this one unbroken forest. And that's not really true. There were openings in the forest. There were places where the forest was burned. There were places where there were wet soils and trees could not grow. And so there were openings and small meadows that were present in the eastern deciduous forest. But the ones in French Creek were very astounding for their size. These were much larger than most people had seen. And again, this is not the prairie region of the Midwestern United States. It borders on it, but it is not. And Washington's map of 1753 shows some of these grasslands in sort of hashering or kind of dotted format here along some of these areas of French Creek. It's kind of hard to make out the detail in this map. By the way, Washington was probably the first person to call French Creek, although there was some debate that perhaps there was another military officer a few years earlier that called it French Creek, again, because of the French occupation. Okay, so that's a little bit about George Washington's observations from the Venango Path in French Creek Valley. I want to talk about Henry Bouquet and his associates, who were primarily in the area doing the mop-up after the French left in 1759 and stayed until about 1760 or so. So Bouquet and his associates followed the retreat of the French from the Allegheny Valley, and he has extensive correspondence. In fact, the Pennsylvania Museum and Historic Commission has a 6-volume set that's out there, and a lot of these books are not small. I mean, they are thick. I have 3 volumes of those, and they are very useful and very insightful in terms of the nature of the times of 1750s to 1760s. And some of his correspondence has some really great environmental information. For example, this is a comment that Henry Bouquet made at Venango on 18 July 1760. Venango, the finest meadows I ever saw, some 2.5 miles long, 1 mile wide without a tree or bush. And the grass, I love this, 5 feet 8 inches high. You want to bet maybe that Henry Bouquet was 5 feet 8 inches tall? That's a possibility. The Indians say there is for 20 miles such savanna along the several branches of the Beef River. Now, this high stature grass is interesting as an ecologist because not a lot of grasses reach that particular high stature. And I'm standing here on the banks of the Allegheny River, and one of my key culprits that I'm trying to attached to wet prairies in the French Creek Valley is this. It's called freshwater cordgrass or prairie cordgrass. And it's related to the salt marsh grass, Spartina, that you see along the eastern coast and also along the shores of Lake Erie. So it's freshwater cordgrass, Spartina pectinatus, and it can reach heights of almost 7 feet tall. So it's a large stature grass. And there are several others, big bluestem, switchgrass, and Indian grass can also achieve those heights. I just want to make an aside comment here about the French name for French Creek, which is Rivière aux Boeufs. Sometimes it's been translated as the River of Beef, and some folks believe that is in reference to bison being present in the French Creek Valley during that time period. But there's no hard evidence for bison in historic times. In French Creek or any other place in Pennsylvania, there are no remains that show up in the archaeological record, for example, in Pennsylvania. And one of the things that the French did oftentimes when they built a new fort, they might have named it after someone who had been martyred, particularly a Jesuit missionary or someone along those lines. And it's thought that perhaps this name, Auboeufs, may have been in reference to the martyred Father Jean de Brébeuf. He was a missionary to the Hurons for the most part. And like many of these missionaries, he was a gifted linguist. In fact, a lot of what we know about Native American languages in Pennsylvania and portions of the eastern United States is by virtue of missionaries in Pennsylvania, particularly the Moravians. He was killed in 1649 at Michilimackinac in Michigan. And of course, he was killed in kind of a gruesome manner, as you can see here in this image on the right. So I always like to throw that in about bison in the French Creek Valley. You can't obviously rule it out completely, but not in historic times. I want to focus now on one of my favorite gentlemen of the time period, Thomas Hutchins. My wife often asks me, who would you like to meet from the 18th century? And, you know, I always used to think, George Washington. But there are some of these people like Thomas Hutchins, Christopher Gist, that I would just love to meet. They're just amazing people. Well, Thomas Hutchins was a surveyor and engineer. He supposedly was born around 1730 in Monmouth County, New Jersey. He was an orphan. Little was known of his early life. However, he must have attained some level of education because he was a gifted surveyor. He was very good in terms of mathematics. He left for the Western country, which was basically the frontier of Pennsylvania during that time period, by the age of 16. He was commissioned as an ensign in the 2nd Pennsylvania Regiment in 1756, and subsequently promoted to lieutenant and quartermaster at Fort Pitt. In the Henry Bouquet letters, there's some interesting mentions of the volume of bison and bear meat and turkeys that they were provisioning at Fort Pitt, and Thomas Hutchins had a lot to do with payment. But he also served the Forbes expedition. In 1759, he was sent to inventory the forts that were abandoned in the French Creek Valley by Henry Bouquet. So he was sent there to ascertain if there was anything left of the forts, and really there wasn't. They were pretty much burned. Even the iron that was always important for secondary uses on the frontier was taken. So there was very little there. In 1760, he became assistant to Indian agent George Crowan and returned to the French Creek Valley, particularly to Presque Isle, to meet British troops that were returning from Fort Niagara, which was taken from the French. He had various military and surveying duties thereafter, and he is noted as the first and only official geographer of the United States. He died in 1789 in Pittsburgh for conditions I'm not sure of. He left us a legacy of documents and perhaps one of the coolest maps of the time period. This is his map of the Eastern United States and Midwestern, I guess you can't really call it United States yet, Midwestern territories, Ohio country, if you want to call it that he published in 1778. And one of the beauties of this is he's got some details on this map, particularly the Ohio country as a whole. He talks about different types of vegetations, savannas and meadows, and he talks about swamps, and he talks about different types of timbered land and salt licks. It's a tremendous source of environmental information. But in this inset here, I have a little bit of information on the French Creek Valley from Venango on up to Presque Isle. And you notice all the tributaries that are present there, but you also see sort of curvy lines that are going through the landscape. Those are Native American trails. And the one that is extending here from Venango up through the French Creek Valley to Presque Isle is the Venango Path. So Hutchins made some interesting observations. Here's his march from Venango to Presque Isle in July 1760. He said, march 2.5 miles through a low, rich bottom to Sugar Creek. If you're familiar with Sugar Creek, it is somewhere halfway between Franklin and Cochranton, perhaps on Route 322, which follows a portion of the Venango Path. The bottom continues a mile further and is full of runs, so it's a well-watered land. Now ascended another steep hill and alternately traversed little and low bottoms for 4 miles and then encamped. The woods open and very young. That's an interesting comment, and I'll get to that in a moment. Another comment from Hutchins in July 1760, marched through low open grounds almost all this day. So this is non-timbered habitat. We came upon a high sidling hill opposite to Custaloga's town. That was a Delaware town, largely, that was located at the confluence of Deer Creek and French Creek. Again, somewhere getting close to Cochranton. 2 miles further are 3 Mingo huts. If you're familiar with Mingo, those are usually Iroquois, often Seneca. A mile beyond which we met with the richest meadows, richest meadows I ever saw, quite clear for more than 2 miles length at a half a mile broad. Marched 13 miles, excellent food, open woods, but no timber. When he's talking about excellent food, he's not talking about Burger Kings or anything like that. He's talking about forage for his pack animals, his horses in particular. So that tells you right then and there that there's very good meadow and pasture land that he is going through. And again, he points out where these areas are in general, on his map. Large meadow areas near LaBeouf, Mingo's Meadows, which looks like it's somewhere in the neighborhood of Meadville. So why were the woods open in spots? Well, in 1759, Captain Charles Lee was coming from Fort Niagara, and he came down the French Creek Valley. And he said this: "We proceeded down the river about 40 miles and arrived at Venango, which is Venango. The country on each side excessively fine and thickly settled by Delaware Indians." So there was a lot of Native American influence in terms of their activities on the landscape. And these open woods may have been created by Native American land use practices, particularly burning and agriculture. I was going to try and talk a little bit about the southern Venango Path and some of the observations of environment that were made there by various military parties. But I really didn't have time to do that. But one of the things that you'll find if you read Hutchins' work and other works of the southern Venango Path is they talk about going through barrens. And a barren is just a general term of land that people think is worthless. It's barren. It can't really grow crops. It doesn't do a good job at growing trees. And I thought about that for a while, about these open woods that were present there. And barrens, and finally ran across another account that I'd forgotten about by George Burgess, which was done in 1795. He talks about barrens, and then he talks about burnt. None of these other surveyors and military folks even mention presence of fire. They talk about barren lands. So these open woods may have been created by Native American land use practices, particularly burning, and to some extent, maybe even agriculture and former village sites that were recovering, regenerating. Okay, Jacob Eyerly, as I said, was a Moravian surveyor, and he helped survey 5,000 acres of land that was granted to the Moravians in the Erie Triangle by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. That consisted of 2 tracts, one on the Pennsylvania-Ohio line called Hospitality, it was on Conneaut Creek, and the other one was called the Good Luck Tract, pretty much at Waterford there, LaBeouf. The Good Luck Tract was on French Creek. And I want to give you some observations of Mr. Eyerly on that Good Luck Tract. May 27th, 1794, went to look at land along French Creek, walked in grass up to the armpits in the bottoms beside the creek. Now think about Henry Bouquet's comment about grass being 5 feet 8 inches tall. Well, this is up to the armpits, so it's getting kind of close there, and about 4 feet tall. 10 to 12 June, the French Creek Tract is very good land, rich with many clearings in the bottoms where the Indians used to dwell. And where these bottoms are cleared, they're densely overgrown with white walnut, wild cherries, and the like. I've seen hawthorns there that were from 12 to 15 inches in diameter. There are all sorts of trees in the uplands. I don't think I've ever seen a hawthorn 12 to 15 inches in diameter. This is old growth hawthorn for the most part, which is pretty much unheard of. In looking at these comments, you realize that the vegetation was particularly diverse, and probably Native American land use practices are associated with that. And there may even be the possibility that these natives were engaging in some type of agroforestry and actively planting some of these particular important food species like white walnut, which has high fat content in the nuts itself. So what about these extensive meadows? Well, here's some comments from the History of Crawford County from 1885. And these were made by some of the older settlers in the county. When first visited by the whites in 1787, in the valley of French Creek were old meadows destitute of trees and covered with long wild grass and herbage resembling the prairies. Indeed, if you've ever seen the historical map of Pennsylvania that was published in 1875 by Schaefer, it's sort of like a mashup of important things that happened historically in Pennsylvania. If you look at the French Creek Valley, he has the Venango Path going through the French Creek Valley, and he also lists Indian prairies. So for the French Creek prairies to show up in his map, they must have been very singularly important and unique. The Indians alleged that the work had not been done by them, but a tradition among them attributed it to a larger and more powerful race of inhabitants who had preoccupied the country. So basically what they're saying is, we didn't make these prairies, they were here when we showed up. And probably their land use practices perpetuated them as well. So there have been some studies of the soils associated with these prairies, if you want to call them that, meadows, grasslands, and French Creek. And in particular, the studies have focused on something called phytoliths. And these are silicate dioxide crystals that build up in the epidermis of grasses. And they can be diagnostic of certain species, but they can also be diagnostic of a soil supporting grassland. And studies of phytoliths suggest that the French Creek meadows arose about 3,000 to 7,000 years ago. And that was during a particular period called the late hypsothermal climatic period. It was essentially a warm period extending from 9,000 to 5,000 before present. And it's associated with what's been called the extension of the Prairie Peninsula from the Midwestern United States into the east. So it's a possibility that this hypsothermal Prairie Peninsula did extend to some extent in the French Creek Valley. However, the French Creek Valley soils were not true prairie soils. That is, they were not continually influenced by grasses. And they were also influenced by moist, cool conditions in the French Creek Valley. So we probably experienced a climatic change that allowed grasses to literally take root in reference to forests in the French Creek Valley, and those grasses and their prairie conditions persisted through historic periods. Just a little bit about phytoliths. I know it sounds a little weird. What's a phytolith and how is that used, particularly in archaeology? Well, it's produced by many plants, especially grasses. As I said before, it's inorganic. It's made of silica that's absorbed by groundwater and forms these very distinctive structures that can be useful for identification. And one of the beauties of phytoliths, is that they preserve well in most sediments. So if you look, oftentimes you will find, and they can be very, very useful in reconstructing past grasslands. So maybe bison were around in the French Creek Valley, maybe during the hypsothermal. We don't know that, but that is not historic times. So a little summary here of the French Creek meadows. Hutchins identified 2 large meadows along French Creek. They're probably the same ones that Washington saw. The both grasslands were probably seen by Hutchins as well. The Mingo's Meadows was likely near Meadville, and further ground truthing and GIS work is needed. I'm looking at soils right now to try and understand where grasslands may have occurred. And one candidate site is this one here. This is a LiDAR image of the French Creek Valley. Route 322 would be going right over this way up towards Meadville. This is the Wilson Chute area. If you're familiar with it, it's a bridge over French Creek, and there's a really nice kayak launch sitting right in here. This area is perfect for development of wet prairie. I showed you that freshwater cordgrass growing along the Allegheny River. In portions of the Mississippi Valley, it forms dominant prairie vegetation on wetter sites. And the other thing that's interesting about this, you barely see it. Actually, you know, if you drive up 322 and look to the west here as you're heading towards Meadville, you will see these what look like streams at relative intervals going across this flat area. Those are drainage ditches, and you can see some of that evidence here. This is hillshade LiDAR, so it doesn't show up really well. And with aerial photography going all the way back to 1938, those drainage ditches were still there. So it's a possibility this was a wet prairie that was drained for agricultural use. Now, one other thing I want to talk about in terms of Thomas Hutchins, another unique habitat that he mentions from July 1760, marched through very rich bottoms, commonly called swamps, almost all this day, found about half a mile pretty high open woods, and then fell into a swamp 2.5 miles over, full of the largest cypress trees I ever saw. Well, that's nice, but there are no cypress trees in Pennsylvania. You have to realize back in the 19th century or 18th century, even 19th century, there was a lot of leeway given for names of trees and vegetation. So what was this cypress? Could it be tamarack, for example? That species occurs in the area. So that piqued my interest. And so I was wondering, what was Hutchins cypress and where was the swamp? Could we find it? Hutchins must have already known a cypress tree just in general based on his comment. He eventually would survey in Florida, so he probably became familiar with, for example, bald cypress, but he was not in Florida prior to his work in the French Creek Valley. He also wrote a companion volume to his map, which is really nice. In his 1778 work on the topography of Pennsylvania, Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina, he notes a difference between cypress and cedar. So he's not a lumper in terms of all these evergreen things are, cypresses. And that's important because there is some consideration from other scholars that perhaps what he's talking about is northern white cedar. And that's also not a common species in Pennsylvania. So my hypothesis was that tamarack was Hutchins cypress. It's native Pennsylvania. It's adapted to poorly drained soils, often with peat. Native American name was Hackamatak, which tamarack is derived from. And it's a great name because it means damp earth or lowland. So that's where this tree is growing. It has needle-like leaves. And as probably most of you know, even though it's in the pine family, those leaves are deciduous and they drop in the fall, just like cypress does, particularly bald cypress. Now, if you look at the section of detail on Hutchins' map, he lists where the cypress swamp is. And it's somewhere up there near a small lake at LeBoeuf, which would be Waterford and Lake LeBoeuf. Now, one of the things about Hutchins' map is it's pretty good, but it's not spot on in terms of accuracy. And here I have a map, a Thomas Hutchins map overlaid on a current map of Pennsylvania in the eastern United States. And if you look really closely, there's some things that don't match up, but it's relatively close. So you have to realize that X is not probably going to mark the spot precisely in terms of Hutchins' map. So testing this hypothesis to locate that general area, the cypress swamp, obviously Hutchins' 1778 map and writings give us some idea it's near Waterford somewhere. Obtained spatial data on tamarack in Pennsylvania. I did that using Pennsylvania spatial data access information, particularly digital information and LiDAR. Really useful databases, the U.S. Geological Survey's Geographic Names Information System. Place names can tell you a lot sometimes about what has happened on a landscape or what grew on a landscape. Also, the Pennsylvania Flora Project database, which is a list of herbarium specimens of plant species for Pennsylvania. Use that information to locate the specific site of the cypress swamp, maybe refine that with further historical documents and validate the site through a field visit. So in the Geographic Name Information System, 10 tamarack place names are known for Pennsylvania for natural features. None were in Hutchinson's map vicinity. And you have to realize that not all names are in the Geographic Names Information Systems because some names for swamps in particular are colloquial. Pennsylvania Flora data has 114 tamarack specimens known from Pennsylvania. And likely this swamp was somewhere in the vicinity of Erie and Crawford counties, and 23 specimens were from there. And in particular, these Erie County specimens are spatially of interest because they're near LeBoeuf. Where in specific? Well, these 5 collections were collected over a range of years and a number of people, but 2 really stick out. The first one, Tamarack Swamp, 1882. Collector Jane Miller collected tamarack there. And then Some of you may know this name, O.E. Jennings, Otto Jennings, who was a botanist at the Carnegie Museum, who Jennings Environmental Center in Butler County is named after. In 1926, he collected tamarack from Tamarack Swamp and listed where that was geographically near Waterford in a bog. So that's looking pretty good. Now, in terms of historical information on Erie County and Tamarack Swamps, there's one particular quote that's very telling. The first one here, Tamarack Swamp stretches across the watershed of the Great Divide in Erie County. So this is divide between the watersheds that drain to the north into Lake Erie and those that drain to the south into French Creek. So look for the divide. On the highest land of the Waterford-McKean Township line, so giving us good spatial data, joining the sources of Elk and Conneauty Creeks. Again, the most noteworthy swamp of the county is the Tamarack Swamp, named from the larch from which it has its habitat. It extends from near Waterford west into McKean Township and is a source of both Elk and LaBeouf Creeks, again, sitting on that divide. And then finally, from Nelson's Biographical Dictionary, 1896, Tamarack Swamp is about 2 miles long by 100 yards wide. And if you remember Hutchins' comment, fell into a cypress swamp 2.5 miles long. So sounds pretty good. So testing that hypothesis, I came up with this particular locale here. We have the watershed divide going right here. So everything to the northwest is draining into Lake Erie. Everything to the south is draining into French Creek here via a trout run into LaBeouf and then into French Creek. So this is a possible area of where Tamarack Swamp was. Now, one other comment from Nelson's Biographical Dictionary makes things a little bit more difficult to reconstruct, that the swamp itself was being destroyed during that time period. The swamp is being ditched and drained and will ultimately be one of the richest parts of the county. Now, I'll tell you, they did not succeed at doing that. If you look at aerial photos or if you're on the ground, the swamp is not there. It's more of an open marsh type of habitat with some open water that's present. And if you look at aerial photography, you can actually see where there were ditches that were drained, or excuse me, put in to drain this particular swamp. Oh, and by the way, that's, yeah.
We're over an hour and we're not sure when Zoom might cut us off.
Okay,
so,
I'll fast forward.
And we got three questions, but
okay.
Okay.
All right. So in summary for Tamarack or a cypress hypothesis, it looks pretty good that the Tamarack was the Hutchins cypress 1760, and the swamp was probably in Erie County. And then the 19th century land use change, particularly through draining, altered that landscape. So just in summary, the French Creek Valley along the Venango Path, the land was well watered. It was a very rich particular landscape. There were a lot of low, rich, and level lands along French Creek, diverse upland forest, hemlock, white pine swamps, as well as other wetlands. And early writings indicate many open areas, savannas, which are basically grasslands with scattered trees, meadows, and bottoms, some extensive, which suggests some Native American land use influence in conjunction with natural factors. Okay, so with that, I'll leave you to my assistant here, and he can answer any questions that you may have, particularly about swimming.
Hey, thank you so much. Since we're talking about cypress, any chance that Hutchinson was on track when he called the hawthorns a hawthorn? Might that have been some other tree that was that large?
They're pretty distinct, so I think probably that identification is good. And as well, there were a number of other species that were identified that seemed correct, that should be in that habitat. So yeah, there's always speculation, you know, when you look at historic documents, how accurate can they be? Can there be some bias to them? So, you know, that's a good question. Very good. But I feel it's probably spot on.
In the 1753 period, how wide would the Venango path have been, and particularly in that 1B section where you studied?
Yeah, that's a good question. even though these folks passing through the landscape notice the landscape, they don't talk much about the path. They talk about the conditions of the path, whether, it was miry or whether a horse got stuck. I think Henry Bouquet had a comment of the path is not well maintained and it's only a few feet wide. But if you get up into the Presque Isle Portage, that's a completely different situation. There, that road that the French constructed can be 40 feet wide in spots. So generally it was considered to be relatively small, but there's not a lot of information that we do have on it.
Very good. Speaking of the path not being in great shape, what happened if an old growth tree fell across the path? Did they take stone axes and whittle, or did they have to just make a little detour around it?
Yeah, the Native Americans would not have maintained the path. There is a passage in a journal on the southern portion of Venango Path where they had the surveyors and military people had to divert off of the Venango Path for almost 6 miles because apparently there was some type of microburst thunderstorm or hurricane that leveled old growth chestnut forest all down the path. So they had to divert around it. So yeah, very little maintenance.
Maybe the last question I have here, have you done any research on the I'm going to butcher this, the Tuscarawas Trail, Tuscarawas.
Tuscaroras? No, I haven't done anything on that. Obviously, named for the Tuscarora Indians, which became the 6th nation of the Iroquois in 1750 something, 53.
Well, great. You might see in the chat, someone just made a reference to a presentation happening at the Heinz History Center March 13th. So thanks for that.
Oh, good.
Thank you all. And we're getting many other notes about how much people enjoyed the presentation.
Oh, good.
Thank you for joining us today. As I mentioned, this program was recorded and should be available for viewing tomorrow on the Washington Trail website, washingtonstrail.org, and that was listed in the chat section early on. That should be up by tomorrow afternoon. The website has other historic related presentations, as well as a wealth of information about Washington's 1753 mission and the French and Indian War in Western Pennsylvania. You'll also notice a donate button. As I mentioned earlier, we are fundraising now to build a bigger, better website that will help teachers and students of all ages learn about this important time in Pennsylvania history, a time that shaped a young George Washington into the military and political leader he eventually became. Donations of any size will get put to good use. So this concludes our program. And
we have had another question or two coming through. If we
go ahead.
don't
Go ahead,
mind,
Marilyn.
could we loop back here?
Sure.
First one of those is a question: are there any physical evidence of the Venango Path visually apparent in Clarion County?
In Clarion County, I know of none.
Okay.
So, Wallace did a good job, I think, in trying to reconstruct where some of these paths went, but many of them have been preempted by roads or have gone through areas that have been strip mined or farmed. So there's very little. The Goshenk path that I was mentioning going through the Piney Tract would be completely destroyed by strip mining at this point in time. So yeah, very few remnants, if any. There might be some.
Okay, thank you. That was, and other compliments are coming through as well.
Oh, good, good.
We do
always
want to
nice.
extend thank you again to Dr. Williams and also Rodney Gash and to the Butler Tourism Office, which has been our host for today's extended Zoom.
All right, and to you, Marilyn.
I enjoyed it too. Last chance for questions. Okay, if not, then thank you again. If you have friends that were not able to catch the program, feel free to share the links with them as well. And thank you again.
Thank you.